Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the disturbing things that were completely normal in Tudor England. A world where harsh punishments, deadly diseases, and brutal daily life shaped every moment. So please subscribe to the channel and settle in for tonight's journey. Imagine waking up in England more than 400 years ago. The air outside. Your small home smells of smoke from hundreds of fires burning across the town. The streets are muddy, crowded, and filled with animals wandering freely between people. What would seem shocking to a modern visitor would appear completely ordinary to everyone around you. In Tudor England, life was not measured by comfort. It was measured by survival. Every day began with uncertainty. A simple illness could become a death sentence. A poor harvest could leave entire families hungry for months. Yet the people of the time accepted these dangers as a normal part of life. One of the most disturbing realities was public punishment. Today, most punishments happen behind prison walls. But in Tudor England, they were often public events. Crowds gathered in town squares to watch criminals receive their sentences. People brought food, talked with neighbours, and treated these occasions almost like entertainment. Children stood beside adults watching scenes that would horrify modern audiences. The government believed public punishment would discourage crime by showing everyone the consequences of breaking the law. Disease was another constant companion. Without modern medicine, people had little understanding of how illnesses spread. Outbreaks could sweep through communities with frightening speed. Even wealthy families lived with the fear that sickness could enter their homes at any moment. Doctors often relied on treatments that sound strange today. Bloodletting remained common, and many remedies were based more on tradition than science. Yet people trusted these methods because they had few alternatives. Hygiene was also very different from modern standards. Waste often ended up in streets or nearby waterways. Clean drinking water was not always easy to find. Strong smells filled towns and cities, but residents became accustomed to them because they had known nothing else. For many Tudor people, daily life involved conditions that would be considered unacceptable today. Yet these conditions were simply part of the world they understood. As evening arrived and candles flickered in dark homes, families gathered knowing tomorrow would bring the same challenges. Life was hard, uncertain, and often cruel. But to the people living it, this was simply normal. For ordinary people, work consumed nearly every waking hour. There were no weekends in the modern sense, no paid vacations, and very little free time. Men, women, and even children were expected to contribute to the survival of the household. A child who could help with simple tasks was often given responsibilities at a young age. What modern people would call child labour was simply considered part of growing up. Families depended on every pair of hands. Another reality that would shock modern audiences was the constant presence of death. Few families escaped the loss of loved ones. Infant mortality was tragically common. Many children never reached adulthood, and parents lived with the painful knowledge that not every child would survive. Funerals and mourning were familiar experiences throughout life. This constant exposure to death shaped how people viewed the world. They understood that life could change suddenly and without warning. Food could also be surprisingly dangerous. Wealthy households displayed their status through enormous feasts. But preserving food safely remained difficult. Spoiled food could cause serious illness, During poor harvests, many families were forced to eat whatever they could find. Bread was a staple for most people. But even bread quality varied greatly depending on wealth and local conditions. Hunger remained a real threat for thousands of people across the kingdom. Marriage was another area where expectations differed dramatically from today. Many marriages were influenced by family interests, financial concerns, or social connections. Personal happiness was not always the primary consideration. Women especially had fewer choices than modern women. Society expected them to obey fathers before marriage and husbands afterward. Opportunities for independence were limited, and strict social rules governed nearly every aspect of daily behaviour. Crime and fear also shaped Tudor life. Towns lacked modern police forces, and people often relied on neighbours or local officials for protection. At night, streets could become dangerous places. Travellers faced risks from thieves, and rumours of criminals spread quickly through communities. Yet despite these hardships, people still found ways to celebrate. Festivals, religious holidays, music, storytelling, and community gatherings provided moments of joy. These brief escapes helped people endure lives that were often difficult and unpredictable. Looking back today, it is astonishing how many harsh realities Tudor people accepted as ordinary. Their world was filled with dangers, limitations, and suffering that would seem unbearable to many modern observers. Yet they carried on because they knew no other way of life. Religion played a powerful role in Tudor society, influencing nearly every part of daily life. People attended church regularly, not only because of faith, but because it was expected by both society and the government. Missing services could attract unwanted attention. Sermons shaped public opinion, and religious beliefs affected everything from education to politics. During the Tudor period, England experienced dramatic religious changes that created uncertainty and fear. Ordinary people often found themselves caught between changing laws and competing beliefs. A wrong word spoken to the wrong person could lead to suspicion, questioning, or even punishment. Another disturbing aspect of Tudor life was the limited understanding of mental illness. Conditions that modern medicine recognizes and treats were often misunderstood. Some individuals were viewed as cursed, possessed, or morally flawed. Communities frequently relied on superstition to explain unusual behaviour. Fear of witches and dark forces existed throughout many areas of the country. Accusations could spread rapidly through villages, damaging reputations and sometimes leading to serious consequences. Homes themselves offered little comfort compared to modern standards. Many buildings were cold during winter and difficult to keep warm. Despite constant fires, smoke often filled rooms because chimneys were not always efficient. Privacy was rare. Large families sometimes shared small spaces, and servants frequently lived alongside the households they served. At night, darkness covered the landscape. Without electric lights, even simple tasks became difficult after sunset. The sounds of animals, wind, and distant voices filled the night air. Travel was equally challenging. Roads were often muddy, uneven, and dangerous. A journey that takes an hour today could require an entire day. News travelled slowly, and many people spent their whole lives within a relatively small distance from where they were born. Most had little knowledge of distant places beyond stories and rumours. Social class determined nearly everything. Wealth, clothing, education, opportunities, and even legal treatment could vary greatly depending on a person's position in society. The rich enjoyed privileges unavailable to ordinary workers, while the poor struggled through lives of constant labour. Yet despite these inequalities, Tudor society accepted the system as natural and necessary. Zu modern ist this word forgiving. But for the people living within it, these customs, fears, and hardships formed the normal rhythm of everyday life. They adapted to conditions that would challenge most people today, finding ways to survive in a society that demanded resilience from everyone who lived within it. Perhaps one of the most unsettling realities of Tudor England was how easily violence became part of every life. People witnessed fights, punishments, and injuries far more often than most modern individuals ever will. Medical care remained limited, so even minor accidents could become serious. A deep cut from a tool, an infected wound, or a simple fever might end a life that otherwise seemed healthy. Communities learned to live with risks that would be considered unacceptable today. Animals were also a constant presence. Livestock often lived close to people, especially in rural areas. Chickens wandered through yards. Pigs moved through streets. And horses provided transportation and labour. The sounds and smells of animals blended with daily life. While modern cities separate people from livestock, Tudor towns frequently mixed the two together. The result was a world that felt crowded, noisy, and often unpleasant by modern standards. Education was another privilege unavailable to many. Wealthier families could afford tutors or schools, while poorer children usually spent their time working. Literacy rates were far lower than today. Many people could not read official documents, books, or letters. Information spread mainly through conversation, church announcements, and public proclamations. Rumours travelled quickly, and false stories could influence entire communities. In a world without newspapers, television, or the internet, people often relied on whatever information reached them first. Fear of authority shaped daily behaviour as well. The monarch's power touched every level of society. Laws could change rapidly, and citizens were expected to obey. Speaking against the government or questioning official policies carried serious risks. People learned to be cautious about what they said and whom they trusted. Even private conversations could become dangerous if repeated by the wrong person. Despite all these hardships, Tudor people developed remarkable resilience. They celebrated births, marriages, harvests, and religious festivals. Music filled taverns and homes. Storytellers entertained audiences with tales of heroes, battles, and distant lands. Families gathered around fires during long evenings, sharing news and memories. These simple pleasures provided comfort in a world filled with uncertainty. Looking deeper into Tudor England reveals a society that was both fascinating and frightening. Many customs that seemed ordinary then appear shocking now. Yet understanding these realities helps us appreciate how dramatically life has changed. Over the centuries, the Tudor world was not a place of comfort or safety, but it was the reality millions of people called home, and their ability to endure such conditions remains one of the most remarkable parts of their story. The justice system of Tudor England could be incredibly harsh by modern standards, Many crimes carried punishments that seem extreme today. Stealing valuable goods, repeatedly breaking laws, or challenging authority could result in severe penalties. Authorities believed fear was one of the best ways to maintain order. Public displays of punishment served as warnings to everyone watching. People grew up seeing these scenes and accepted them as part of everyday life. While many citizens disliked such spectacles, few openly questioned them because they had been taught that strict justice protected society from chaos. Clothing also revealed a great deal about a person's place in the world. In Tudor England, appearance was closely tied to social status. Certain fabrics, colours, and styles were restricted to specific classes. Wealthy nobles wore expensive materials that ordinary people could never afford. In some cases, laws even regulated what different groups were allowed to wear. A person's clothing instantly communicated wealth, occupation, and social position. This created a society where status could often be identified before a single word was spoken. Women faced especially strict expectations. Their behaviour, appearance, and responsibilities were carefully monitored by family and community members. Respectability was considered extremely important. Women were expected to manage households, raise children, and support family interests. Those who challenged social expectations often faced criticism or suspicion. While some women achieved influence and success, daily life remained heavily shaped by rules created largely by men. Entertainment could be surprisingly brutal as well. Activities that drew large crowds sometimes involved animal fighting and other spectacles that modern audiences would find disturbing. Such events were viewed as normal recreation. People gathered to socialize, place bets, and enjoy the excitement. The idea that animals deserved protection from cruelty was far less developed than it is today. What seems shocking now was often considered harmless fun by many Tudor spectators. Natural disasters and poor weather could quickly turn life upside down. A long period of rain might damage crops, while drought could reduce harvests. Since most people depended directly or indirectly on agriculture, bad weather affected entire communities. Food prices rose, hunger spread, and anxiety increased. Families often had little control over forces that determined whether they would prosper or struggle. This uncertainty shaped the mindset of Tudor society. People learned to endure setbacks and adapt to difficult circumstances. Their world demanded patience, toughness, and acceptance of hardships that modern people rarely experience. Yet despite every challenge, generation after generation continued building lives, raising families, and hoping for a better future in a kingdom that could be as unforgiving as it was fascinating. Food and drink reveal another side of Tudor life that would surprise many modern people. Clean water was not always trusted, especially in crowded towns where contamination was common. Because of this, people often drank weak ale with meals, including children. The alcohol content was usually low, but the practice would still seem unusual today. Diets depended heavily on social class. Wealthy families enjoyed imported spices, fine meats, and elaborate feasts that demonstrated status and power. Poorer families survived on bread, porridge, vegetables, and whatever food they could produce themselves. During difficult years, some households faced genuine hunger, and every meal became precious. Fire was both essential and dangerous. Nearly every home relied on open flames for cooking, heating, and light. A single accident could destroy an entire building. In crowded towns, fires sometimes spread rapidly from house to house. People lived with this risk constantly. There were no modern fire departments ready to respond within minutes. Once a blaze began, communities often had to rely on buckets, simple tools, and collective effort to stop the destruction. Nighttime brought a completely different world. Without electric lighting, darkness covered streets and countryside soon after sunset. Travellers moved carefully, carrying lanterns or torches when possible. Shadows filled narrow roads, and unfamiliar sounds seemed more threatening than they might during daylight. Most people preferred remaining indoors after dark unless necessary. The night belonged to uncertainty, rumour, and imagination. Even simple journeys could feel intimidating. Superstition influenced many aspects of daily life. People searched for meaning in unusual events, strange weather, or unexpected misfortune. Charms, folk remedies, and traditional beliefs remained common throughout the kingdom. Many individuals sincerely believed that unseen forces affected everyday events. Good luck and bad luck were taken seriously, and customs passed down through generations shaped behaviour in countless ways. Family life was often strict. Children were expected to respect authority and contribute to household responsibilities. Discipline could be severe compared to modern standards. Parents believed obedience was necessary for survival in a difficult world. Affection certainly existed, but it was often expressed differently than it is today. Practical concerns frequently came before emotional comfort. Yet despite these differences, families still shared hopes, fears, and dreams much like families do now. They worried about loved ones, celebrated successes, and mourned losses. The more we explore Tudor England, the clearer it becomes that normal life was filled with experiences that modern people would find shocking. What makes this period so fascinating is not just how different it was, but how ordinary people adapted to those differences and continued, moving forward through a world that constantly tested their strength and determination. Markets were among the busiest places in Tudor England and offered a fascinating glimpse into daily life. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and customers gathered together in noisy streets, filled with shouting, voices, and competing sellers. The smell of fresh bread mixed with livestock, smoke, and mud. There were no supermarkets with fixed prices. Bargaining was common, and buyers often negotiated directly with sellers. News, gossip, and rumours spread through these crowded gatherings, almost as quickly as goods changed hands. For many people, the market was not just a place to shop, but also a centre of social life. Yet, even these lively spaces could become dangerous. Pickpockets looked for opportunities among distracted crowds, and arguments sometimes escalated into physical confrontations. Housing conditions varied greatly depending on wealth. Nobles lived in impressive residences with large halls, servants, and decorative furnishings. Most ordinary people, however, lived in much smaller homes. Families often shared limited space, and comfort was a luxury rather than an expectation. During winter, cold winds found their way through cracks in walls and windows. During summer, unpleasant odours became stronger in crowded settlements. People adapted because they had little choice. The idea that every person should enjoy modern levels of privacy. Sanitation and convenience simply did not exist. Travellers faced particular hardships. Inns provided shelter along major routes, but journeys remained exhausting and unpredictable. Roads were frequently damaged by weather and heavy use. Rain could transform paths into deep mud, slowing progress dramatically. A trip between towns required planning, patience, and a willingness to accept discomfort. Travellers carried stories from distant regions, bringing news that might take weeks or even months to spread across the country. Because information moved slowly, many communities remained relatively isolated compared to today's interconnected world. Another striking feature of Tudor life was the importance of reputation. In small communities, everyone knew one another's business. Rumours could damage a person standing for years. Trust was valuable because people relied heavily on neighbours during difficult times. A good reputation could open doors, while a bad one could create obstacles in nearly every aspect of life. This constant social pressure encouraged conformity and discouraged behaviour that might attract criticism. Nature also shaped daily existence in powerful ways. People spent much more time outdoors than most modern individuals. They paid close attention to seasons, weather patterns, and agricultural cycles because survival depended upon them. A successful harvest brought relief and celebration. A failed harvest brought anxiety and fear. Entire communities lived according to rhythms set by the natural world. As we continue deeper into Tudor England, it becomes clear that everyday life required resilience at every turn. From crowded markets and difficult journeys to harsh living conditions and constant social pressure, ordinary people navigated challenges that modern society has largely forgotten. Yet somehow they endured, building communities and carrying on through a world that demanded strength every single day. Even personal cleanliness looked very different in Tudor England. Contrary to popular myths, people did wash themselves, but not with the regularity or convenience modern people enjoy. Bathing required time, effort, and resources. Heating enough water for a full bath was expensive for many households. As or result, washing often focused on the face, hands, and visible areas rather than full-body bathing. Clothing was washed more frequently than many people realise because clean garments were believed to help maintain health. Still, compared to modern standards, hygiene remained limited. Life expectancy was also much shorter. Many people never reached old age, not because they were weak, but because dangers surrounded them from birth onward. Disease, accidents, poor nutrition, difficult childbirth, and harsh working conditions claimed countless lives. Reaching 60 years old could be considered an impressive achievement. Elderly people were respected because they had survived challenges that many others had not. Weather could dramatically affect mood and survival. A long winter meant higher fuel costs and increased pressure on food supplies. Storms damaged crops and homes. Flooding could ruin fields that families depended upon for income. Unlike modern societies with extensive infrastructure and emergency services, Tudor communities often had to solve problems themselves. When disaster struck, neighbours depended heavily on one another. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Tudor life was how ordinary people adapted to uncertainty. They could not predict whether illness, hunger, or misfortune might arrive next month. Yet they continued planting crops, raising children, building homes, and planning for the future. Their resilience allowed communities to survive through difficult generations. To modern eyes, Tudor England appears filled with hardships that would be difficult to accept today. Public punishments, widespread disease, social inequality, dangerous travel, and constant uncertainty shaped everyday existence. Yet, for the people who lived there, these conditions were simply part of the world. They laughed, worked, celebrated, worried, and dreamed much like we do now. The difference was that their lives unfolded in a far harsher environment, where survival itself often required courage. And as we continue our journey through Tudor England, we will discover even more surprising realities hidden beneath the surface of this fascinating and often unsettling age. One thing that surprises many historians is how much Tudor people depended on community. Modern individuals can often solve problems alone using technology, transportation, or online services. Tudor families had none of these advantages. If a roof was damaged, a harvest failed, or a family member became ill, neighbours frequently played an important role in providing help. Villages functioned as closely connected networks where cooperation increased the chances of survival. Of course, conflicts existed as well, but people understood that completely isolating themselves from the community could be dangerous. Entertainment often came from simple pleasures. There were no televisions, smartphones, or streaming services. Instead, people gathered to hear musicians, storytellers, or travelling performers. Festivals brought excitement to towns and villages. Games, dancing, and celebrations allowed people to temporarily forget the difficulties of daily life. These events were eagerly anticipated because opportunities for recreation were limited compared to modern society. The natural world felt far larger and more mysterious than it does today. Many forests remained dense and intimidating. Large areas of countryside were sparsely populated. For people travelling through remote regions, unfamiliar sounds in the darkness could spark fear and imagination. Legends about spirits, ghosts, and strange creatures circulated widely. Without scientific explanations for many natural phenomena, mystery remained an important part of everyday life. Work itself was physically demanding. Most tasks relied on human or animal strength. There were no machines to handle much of the labour. Farmers spent long days in fields. Craftsmen worked with tools that required skill and endurance. Servants performed exhausting household duties from sunrise until evening. Physical exhaustion was a normal part of life for millions of people. Looking back, it is easy to focus only on the hardships of Tudor England. Yet the people of the time did not wake up each morning thinking they lived in a terrible age. To them, this was simply life. They found happiness where they could, built friendships, fell in love, raised families, and hoped for better futures. Their world was dangerous, uncomfortable, and often unfair, but it was also filled with determination and human resilience. The more we learn about Tudor England, the more we understand how different the past truly was and how extraordinary the people were who managed to survive it. The relationship between rich and poor in Tudor England was far more visible than it is today. Wealthy nobles lived in grand houses filled with servants. expensive furniture, and imported goods from distant lands. Their meals could include exotic spices that cost enormous amounts of money. Meanwhile, many ordinary families struggled to secure enough food for the coming winter. Poor harvest or sudden illness could push a household into desperate circumstances. The gap between social classes was not merely financial. It influenced nearly every opportunity a person would receive throughout life. Servants formed a large part of Tudor society. Many young people left home and entered service in wealthier households. Their days began before sunrise and often ended long after dark. They cleaned rooms, prepared meals, carried water, tended fires, and completed countless other tasks. Hard work was expected, and mistakes could bring punishment. Yet, for some, service provided food, shelter, and the possibility of improving their future prospects. In a world with limited opportunities, even difficult positions could be valuable. The sounds of Tudor England would also seem unusual to modern ears. Instead of engines and electronic devices, people heard church bells, blacksmith hammers, horse hooves, barking dogs, and merchants calling to customers. Every town possessed its own rhythm. Bells marked important events, announced emergencies, and helped organise daily life. For many people, church bells acted almost like a public clock, guiding the flow of the day. Animals played an essential role in transportation, farming, and trade. Horses moved people and goods across the country. Oxen helped plough fields. Chickens provided eggs, while sheep supplied wool that became one of England's most important industries. Because daily survival depended heavily on animals, people interacted with them constantly. The line between human living spaces and animal spaces was often much smaller than it is today. Fear of famine remained present even during relatively good years. Older generations remembered periods when food became scarce and prices rose dramatically. These memories shaped behaviour. Families stored supplies whenever possible and tried to prepare for difficult times. A series of poor harvests could create widespread suffering across entire regions. Since transportation networks were limited, moving food quickly from one area to another was not always possible. What makes Tudor England so fascinating is that beneath all these differences, the people themselves were remarkably familiar. They worried about their children, hoped for success, feared failure, and dreamed about better lives. Their world may have been harsher and more dangerous than ours, but their emotions were deeply human. As we continue exploring this extraordinary period, we uncover a society filled with challenges, contradictions, and stories that reveal just how far the modern world has travelled from its Tudor past. Law and order in Tudor England depended heavily on local communities. There was no modern police force patrolling streets day and night. Instead, ordinary citizens were often expected to help maintain peace. If a crime occurred, neighbours might be called upon to assist in finding the suspect. Local officials carried significant responsibility, but resources were limited. As a result, justice could sometimes be inconsistent depending on where a person lived. In small villages, everyone knew one another, making it difficult to hide secrets for long. Reputation mattered greatly because trust formed the foundation of community life. Education remained a privilege that many people never experienced. Wealthy families could send their sons to schools where they studied reading, writing, mathematics, and classical languages. Poor children usually learned practical skills instead. They observed parents, relatives, and employers, gaining knowledge through daily work rather than formal lessons. A farmer taught farming, a blacksmith taught metalworking, and a merchant taught trade. Life itself served as the classroom for much of the population. The role of women varied depending on wealth and circumstance, but daily responsibilities were often demanding. Women prepared food, cared for children, managed household tasks, and sometimes helped with family businesses. In rural areas, they might also assist with agricultural work. Their contributions were essential to family survival. Yet historical records frequently focus more on the actions of powerful men. Looking closely reveals that women played a critical role in keeping Tudor society functioning. Seasonal changes influenced nearly every aspect of life. Spring brought planting, summer demanded hard work in fields. Autumn focused on harvesting, and winter tested the ability of families to endure cold, weather, and limited resources. These seasonal rhythms shaped expectations and routines. Unlike modern society, where technology reduces the impact of seasons, Tudor people remained closely tied to nature's calendar. Even news of major events reached people slowly. A royal decision made in London could take considerable time to spread throughout distant regions. Many people learned important information through travellers, merchants, clergy members, or public announcements. Because communication moved slowly, rumours often mixed with facts. Stories changed as they travelled from one person to another, creating confusion and speculation. Perhaps the greatest difference between Tudor life and modern life was uncertainty. Today, many people expect access to healthcare, reliable food supplies, transportation, and information. Tudor people could rely on none of these with confidence. Every year brought new challenges, and every family understood that fortune could change quickly. Yet, despite the hardships, they continued forward with remarkable determination. Their world demanded resilience, patience, and courage, qualities that allowed them to survive in one of history's most fascinating and challenging periods. As the Tudor era continued, cities slowly grew larger, bringing both opportunities and problems. London expanded rapidly and became the heart of politics, trade, and royal power. People travelled there hoping to find work, wealth, or a better future. But crowded streets also created new challenges. Housing became scarce, disease spread more easily, and poverty became increasingly visible. Wealthy merchants built impressive homes while many labourers lived in cramped conditions. The contrast between luxury and hardship could often be seen on the same street. Workshops filled towns with constant activity. Blacksmiths hammered glowing metal into tools and weapons. Bakers rose before dawn to prepare bread for customers. Tailors stitched clothing by hand, while carpenters built furniture and repaired homes. Every object required skilled labour because factories did not yet exist. Even simple items demanded time and effort to produce. As a result, possessions were valued carefully and rarely wasted. For many people, religion provided comfort during difficult times. Life was uncertain, and faith offered explanations for suffering, illness, and loss. Churches served not only as places of worship, but also as important centres of community life. Important announcements were shared there. Relationships were formed there. And many of life's major events were marked there. Births, marriages, and funerals all carried strong religious significance. Another reality of Tudor England was the constant struggle against nature. Storms damaged buildings, floods destroyed crops, and harsh winters tested entire communities. Unlike today, there was little protection from environmental disasters. Families depended heavily on preparation and experience. A mistake in planning for winter could have serious consequences months later. Survival often depended on careful management of food, fuel, and resources. Medical knowledge remained limited despite the efforts of physicians and healers. Many treatments were based on theories that modern science has since rejected. Yet people trusted these methods because they represented the best knowledge available at the time. Herbal remedies, traditional practices, and advice passed down through generations remained common. Some treatments occasionally helped, while others likely made conditions worse. Regardless, illness remained one of the greatest fears in Tudor society. Despite the hardships, people still found reasons to be hopeful. Parents dreamed of opportunities for their children. Apprentices hoped to master valuable skills. Merchants looked for profitable trades. Farmers prayed for successful harvests. These ambitions pushed people forward even when life seemed difficult. The Tudor world was filled with uncertainty, but it was also filled with determination. The deeper we explore this remarkable period, the more we understand that Tudor England was not simply a time of kings and queens. It was a world built by ordinary people working, struggling, and surviving day after day. Their experiences reveal a society that could be harsh and unforgiving, yet also resilient enough to endure generations of change and challenge. By the end of a typical Tudor day, most people were physically exhausted. Long hours of labour left little energy for anything beyond the necessities of life. As darkness settled across villages and towns, families gathered around fireplaces, sharing simple meals and discussing the events of the day. Candlelight provided only limited illumination, and conserving fuel was important. So many people went to sleep much earlier than modern societies do. Nights were quieter, darker, and often filled with uncertainty. The absence of modern technology meant that patience was an essential skill. Messages travelled slowly, work required manual effort, and solving even small problems could take significant time. Yet Tudor people adapted to these conditions because they knew no alternative. Their expectations were shaped by the realities around them rather than by the conveniences we often take for granted today. Looking back across the Tudor era, what stands out most is not merely the hardship but the resilience of the people who endured it. They faced disease without modern medicine, uncertainty without reliable safety nets, and difficult labour without machines. Still, they built communities, raised families, created traditions, and shaped the foundations of the England that would follow. Many of the things they considered completely normal would shock modern audiences. But understanding those differences helps us appreciate both their struggles and their strength. And as our journey through Tudor England continues, even more surprising and unsettling realities await us just beyond the next chapter of history. Yet, beneath the struggles of daily survival, Tudor England was also a world obsessed with status and appearance. People paid close attention to how others dressed, spoke, and behaved. A person's accent, clothing, and manners could immediately reveal their place in society. Social boundaries were taken seriously, and many believed that Maintaining order depended on everyone knowing their proper position. Ambition existed, but opportunities to rise in status were limited compared to the modern world. Royal events captured the attention of the entire kingdom. News of a royal wedding, birth, or death spread rapidly despite the slow communication of the era. Kings and queens seemed distant to most ordinary people, yet their decisions could dramatically affect daily life. New taxes, religious reforms, or changes in law often reached every corner of the country. For many citizens, the actions of the crown felt like powerful forces beyond their control. The countryside dominated Tudor England. Most people lived in rural communities surrounded by fields, forests, and farmland. The rhythm of life followed the agricultural calendar. Planting, harvesting, and preparing for winter shaped the year. Unlike modern cities that never seem to sleep, many Tudor villages became quiet after sunset. Darkness covered roads and fields, leaving only scattered candlelight visible through windows. Fear remained a constant companion. People feared illness, hunger, crime, bad harvests, and political upheaval. Yet they also developed remarkable mental strength. Generations grew up understanding that life would contain hardship. Instead of expecting comfort, they focused on endurance. This mindset helped communities survive challenges that might overwhelm many modern societies. At the same time, people still laughed, celebrated, and enjoyed moments of happiness. Weddings brought entire communities together. Seasonal festivals offered music, dancing, and games. Storytellers entertained audiences with tales of heroes, battles, and adventures. Even in difficult times, people searched for reasons to smile and hope for the future. Perhaps that is the most important lesson from Tudor England. It was a world filled with conditions that modern people would find shocking, uncomfortable, and even terrifying. Yet the people who lived there did not see themselves as victims of history. They simply lived their lives, adapting to the circumstances around them. Their resilience allowed them to endure disease, uncertainty, and hardship while continuing to build families and communities. The more we examine Tudor England, the more we discover not only a strange and fascinating society, but also the enduring strength of ordinary human beings facing extraordinary challenges. As Tudor England moved toward the end of the 16th century, the kingdom was changing, but daily life for ordinary people remained difficult. Most families still depended on hard work, favourable weather, and good health to survive. A single unexpected problem could undo years of effort. If the main breadwinner became sick, the entire household might struggle. If crops failed, savings could disappear quickly. Security was fragile, and people understood that fortune could change at any moment. The sea also played an increasingly important role in English life. Ships connected England to distant lands, bringing new goods, ideas, and opportunities. However, sea travel was extremely dangerous. Storms could destroy vessels without warning, and sailors faced disease, hunger, and accidents during long voyages. Yet many still chose this life, hoping for profit, adventure, or a chance to improve their circumstances. Stories from overseas fascinated people who had never travelled far from home. For those living in towns, apprenticeships offered one of the few paths toward a better future. Young boys were often sent to learn trades under experienced craftsmen. The training could last 4 years and required strict discipline. Apprentices worked hard, followed rules, and gradually learned valuable skills. Success might eventually allow them to open their own businesses. This system helped preserve knowledge and ensured that important trades continued from one generation to the next. The elderly occupied a unique place in Tudor society. Those who reached old age often possessed knowledge that younger people respected. They remembered past harvests, old customs, and lessons learned through experience. In a world where books were not always available and many people could not read, memory itself was valuable. Older generations passed down practical wisdom that helped communities survive. Even though life was harsh, people still cared deeply about beauty. Gardens were cultivated, homes were decorated when possible, and special clothing was worn during important occasions. Music remained popular across social classes. Whether performed in a royal court or a village gathering, music provided comfort and enjoyment. These moments remind us that Tudor people sought happiness just as we do today. When we look beyond the kings, queens, and famous historical events, we discover the real heart of Tudor England. It was built by farmers working in fields, craftsmen labouring in workshops, mothers caring for children, and countless ordinary individuals facing the challenges of everyday life. Their world was far from easy, but their determination allowed them to endure conditions that many modern people would find almost impossible. And in that resilience lies one of the most remarkable stories of the Tudor age. Perhaps the most surprising thing about Tudor England is how normal all of these hardships seemed to the people who lived through them. Modern visitors would likely be overwhelmed by the smells, the diseases, the lack of sanitation, and the constant uncertainty. Yet Tudor men and women woke each morning and carried on with their responsibilities, because this was the only world they had ever known. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to adapt, and the people of this era demonstrated that ability every single day. Children grew up quickly in Tudor society. From a young age, they learned practical skills that would help them survive as adults. Childhood was often shorter than it is today, especially among poorer families. Responsibilities arrived early, and many young people were expected to contribute to the household long before reaching adulthood. Despite this, children still found opportunities to play games, explore the countryside, and enjoy moments of freedom whenever work allowed. The natural environment remained both a friend and an enemy. Forests provided wood for fuel and construction. Rivers supplied water and supported trade. Fields produced crops that sustained entire communities. Yet nature could also bring disaster through storms, floods, disease among livestock, or failed harvests. Tudor people respected these forces because they understood how dependent they were upon them. As the years passed, England slowly changed. Trade expanded, cities grew, and new ideas began to spread across the kingdom. But for most ordinary people, daily life continued to revolve around familiar concerns: earning a living, feeding a family, staying healthy, and preparing for the future. Grand historical events often mattered less than whether there would be enough food on the table tomorrow. When historians study Tudor England, they often focus on famous monarchs, political struggles, and dramatic events. Yet the true story of the period belongs just as much to ordinary people whose names were never recorded in history books. They built homes, worked fields, raised children, and endured countless challenges without expecting recognition. Their efforts formed the foundation upon which the entire kingdom rested. The world they inhabited could be cruel, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Public punishments, widespread illness, social inequality, and harsh working conditions were accepted realities. Yet within that difficult environment, people still found friendship, love, humour, and hope. They celebrated victories, mourned losses, and dreamed of better days ahead. In many ways they were different from us, but in many other ways they were exactly the same. Their story reminds us that history is not only about rulers and wars. It is also about ordinary people finding ways to live, survive, and keep moving forward no matter how challenging the world around them may be. And perhaps that is why Tudor England continues to fascinate people centuries later. It was a world balanced between hardship and hope, tradition and change. The kingdom was slowly moving toward a new age. Yet most people still lived lives that would seem ancient by modern standards. They relied on muscle instead of machines, candlelight instead of electricity, and local knowledge instead of instant information. Every achievement required effort, patience, and determination. For many families, survival depended on planning months ahead. Food had to be stored carefully for winter. Clothing needed to be repaired and reused. Tools were valuable possessions because replacing them was expensive. Waste was avoided whenever possible. Modern societies often enjoy abundance, but Tudor households understood the importance of making every resource last. A careless mistake could have consequences for an entire family. Communities were also bound together by shared experiences. Everyone understood the fear of disease. Everyone worried about bad weather. Everyone knew the uncertainty of living in a world where life could change overnight. These common struggles created strong social bonds. Neighbours depended on one another not simply out of kindness, but because cooperation improved the chances of survival. The passage of time felt different as well. Without constant entertainment or rapid communication, life often moved at a slower pace. Seasons marked the year more clearly than calendars. The arrival of spring, the harvest of autumn, and the challenges of winter shaped people's expectations. Nature remained the great force around which daily existence revolved. Yet, despite all the differences, Tudor people shared many of the same emotions we experience today. They felt pride when their hard work succeeded. They worried about loved ones during illness. They celebrated important milestones and mourned painful losses. They dreamed about security, happiness, and a better future for their children. These human experiences connect us to them across the centuries. As we look back on Tudor England, it is easy to focus on the strange customs, harsh punishments, and difficult living conditions. But beneath those differences were ordinary men and women doing their best in a challenging world. Their resilience allowed communities to endure through uncertainty, hardship, and change. And perhaps that is the most remarkable lesson of all. History is not only the story of powerful rulers and famous events. It is also the story of countless ordinary people whose courage, persistence, and determination carried them through lives that were often far more difficult than our own. Their world may be gone, but their story continues to remind us of the incredible strength people can find when faced with adversity. The Tudor world was also a place where information travelled through people rather than technology. News moved from traveller to traveller, merchant to merchant, and village to village. A major event in London might take days or even weeks to become known in distant regions. By the time the story arrived, details were often changed, exaggerated, or misunderstood. Rumours could spread rapidly and sometimes caused fear or confusion. In many ways, reputation and word of mouth carried enormous power. A single story could shape how an entire community viewed a person. Life was deeply connected to the family unit. Few people could survive entirely on their own. Parents, children, relatives, and even servants often worked together to keep a household functioning. Everyone had responsibilities. The success of one family member could benefit the entire household, while a serious problem could affect everyone. This created strong bonds, but also strong expectations. Duty was considered one of the most important values in Tudor society. Many people rarely travelled far from where they were born. Some spent nearly their entire lives within a few miles of their home village. The wider world existed mostly through stories, rumours, and the accounts of travellers. Foreign lands seemed mysterious and distant. For ordinary villagers, even the nearest large town could feel like a different world. This limited perspective made local traditions and customs especially important. At the same time, England was gradually becoming more connected through trade and exploration. New goods arrived from distant regions, bringing unfamiliar foods, materials, and ideas. While these changes affected wealthy people first, they slowly influenced society as a whole. The Tudor period stood at an interesting moment. Between the medieval world and the beginning of a more modern age. Looking around Tudor England, one would see a society full of contradictions. It could be harsh, yet deeply communal, dangerous, yet surprisingly resilient. People lived with constant uncertainty, but still planned for the future. They faced difficulties that modern individuals would struggle to imagine. Yet they continued building homes, raising children, and pursuing their ambitions. The longer we study Tudor life, the clearer it becomes that history is not simply a collection of dates and events. It is the story of real people navigating the challenges of their time. Their tools were simpler, their knowledge more limited, and their lives often shorter. But their determination was extraordinary. Through famine, disease, political upheaval, and everyday hardship, they endured. And it is because of those ordinary people far, more than kings and queens, that the story of Tudor England remains so compelling. Centuries later, even the passage of a single year in Tudor England could bring dramatic changes to a person's life. A good harvest might provide stability and comfort, while a poor one could create hardship that lasted for months. Disease could arrive without warning, affecting entire communities regardless of wealth or status. People learned not to take prosperity for granted, because they understood how quickly circumstances could change. This uncertainty shaped the way they viewed the future. Rather than expecting life to become easier, many focused on enduring whatever challenges came next. The church calendar played a major role in organising the year. Religious festivals broke up long periods of work and gave communities opportunities to gather together. These celebrations brought colour, music, food, and social interaction into lives that were otherwise filled with labour. for a brief time. People could set aside worries and enjoy the company of friends and neighbours. Such moments were important because daily life often demanded constant effort. Animals remained essential partners in survival. Horses carried goods and travellers. Sheep supported the wool trade that contributed greatly to England's economy. Cattle, pigs, and chickens supplied food and other resources. Losing valuable livestock could be financially devastating for a family. As a result, animals were not simply possessions but vital parts of everyday life. Their health and well-being directly affected human survival. Many Tudor people also possessed a strong awareness of hierarchy. Society was structured in clear layers, and most individuals accepted this arrangement as natural. From monarchs and nobles down to labourers and servants, each group was expected to fulfil specific roles. While some questioned aspects of the system, most people focused on succeeding within the position they had been born into. This outlook helped maintain social stability, but also limited opportunities for many individuals. What often surprises modern observers is how much endurance was required just to live an ordinary life. Tasks that now take minutes could require hours. Travel demanded patience. Communication moved slowly. Medical treatment was uncertain. Comforts we consider basic had not yet been invented. Yet Tudor people adapted because adaptation was necessary. They developed practical skills, strong communities, and a mindset capable of facing difficulties head-on. As we continue exploring this remarkable period, we begin to see Tudor England not as a distant and unfamiliar place, but as a world filled with real human experiences. The clothing, technology, and customs may have been different, but the people themselves shared many of the same hopes and fears that exist today. Their story is ultimately one of perseverance, showing how ordinary individuals found ways to survive and build meaningful lives in a world that constantly challenged them. Another aspect of Tudor life that modern people often underestimate is the importance of uncertainty in everyday decision-making. Today, many people can plan weeks, months, or even years ahead with a reasonable expectation that most things will remain stable. In Tudor England, stability was never guaranteed. A family might prepare carefully for the future only to see those plans disrupted by illness, economic hardship, political changes, or bad weather. Because of this, people often focused on immediate responsibilities while hoping circumstances would remain favourable. The relationship between people and authority was also very different from modern expectations. Most ordinary citizens had little influence over national decisions. Laws, taxes, and religious policies were often determined far above their level. Yet those decisions could dramatically affect daily life. Many people viewed authority with a mixture of respect, fear, and dependence. Maintaining order was considered essential because disorder could quickly threaten the survival of entire communities. Craftsmanship held great value throughout Tudor society. Since goods were produced by hand, skilled workers earned respect for their abilities. A talented blacksmith, carpenter, mason, or tailor could become an important member of the local community. Their work shaped the physical world around them, from houses and tools to clothing and furniture. Many of these skills required years of training and experience to master. The pace of change itself was slower than what we experience today. New ideas, technologies, and trends spread gradually. Entire generations might live without witnessing dramatic changes in everyday life. This created a strong sense of continuity. Traditions passed from parents to children and often remained unchanged for decades. Customs carried significant weight because they connected communities to the past and provided stability in an uncertain world. Yet despite the slower pace, Tudor England was not a stagnant society. New opportunities, discoveries, and influences continued to emerge. Trade expanded, exploration increased, and cultural developments slowly reshaped the kingdom. Ordinary people may not always have understood the full significance of these changes, but they were living through a period that would help shape the future of England. What makes the Tudor era so compelling is this combination of familiarity and difference. The people worried about family, work, reputation, and the future just as we do today. But they faced those concerns in a world without modern medicine, technology, transportation, or communication. Their ability to endure such conditions remains remarkable. The more closely we examine their lives, the more we appreciate the determination and adaptability that allowed countless ordinary men and women to navigate a world filled with challenges at every turn. For ordinary Tudor people, the future was often shaped more by luck than by careful planning. A healthy family, productive harvest, and peaceful year could create stability. But a single unexpected event could change everything. This reality encouraged people to value practical skills and strong relationships. Knowing how to repair tools, preserve food, care for animals, or maintain a home could make the difference between comfort and hardship. Survival depended not only on hard work, but also on knowledge passed down through generations. Communities developed traditions that helped people cope with uncertainty. Seasonal celebrations, local customs, and religious ceremonies provided structure in a world where much remained unpredictable. These traditions connected individuals to their neighbours and reminded them that they were part of something larger than themselves. In difficult times, shared beliefs and customs often helped communities remain united. The environment around Tudor people looked very different from the modern landscape. Roads were narrower, towns smaller, and much of the countryside remained undeveloped. Forests covered larger areas, and many journeys required travelling through isolated regions. Without modern lighting, the night felt darker and more mysterious. The stars appeared brighter, and the natural world played a much larger role in daily experience than it does for many people today. Work rarely stopped completely, even when fields rested during winter. Families found other tasks that needed attention. Tools required maintenance, clothing needed repair, and preparations for future seasons continued. Idleness was often viewed negatively because survival demanded constant effort. Every member of a household usually contributed in some way, regardless of age. Looking back, it is tempting to see Tudor England only through the lens of hardship. Certainly life was difficult by modern standards. Disease, poverty, and uncertainty touched countless lives. Yet this period was also filled with resilience, creativity, and determination. People adapted to challenges with remarkable resourcefulness. They built communities, preserved traditions, and created meaningful lives despite the obstacles they faced. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Tudor England is that human beings are capable of adapting to circumstances that seem almost unimaginable to later generations. The men and women of this era lived in a world without modern comforts. Yet they continued to work, celebrate, love, and hope. Their daily lives may seem distant to us now, but their perseverance remains timeless. And the deeper we explore their world, the more we understand that history is ultimately a story of ordinary people finding extraordinary ways to endure. As we spend more time in the world of Tudor England, it becomes clear that patience was one of the most valuable qualities a person could possess. Nearly everything took longer than it does today. Growing food required months of effort. Travelling even short distances could consume an entire day. Messages moved slowly across the country, and important news often arrived long after events had occurred. People learned to live at a pace determined by nature, weather, and physical labour rather than technology. The passing seasons shaped people's emotions as much as their routines. Spring brought hope as fields were planted, and new life appeared across the countryside. Summer demanded intense work under long daylight hours. Autumn was a season of relief and anxiety, as communities waited to see whether harvests would be sufficient. Winter tested everyone. Cold weather, shorter days, and limited food supplies made survival more difficult. Families who had prepared well felt secure, while others worried constantly about making it through until spring. Many Tudor people never imagined that future generations would live so differently. They could not foresee electric lights, modern medicine, automobiles, or instant communication. To them, their way of life seemed normal because it was all they had ever known. The routines, customs, and traditions that appear strange to us were simply part of everyday existence. This reminds us that what feels normal in one era may seem extraordinary in another. The bonds between generations were especially important. Grandparents, parents, and children often lived close to one another, sharing knowledge and responsibilities. Skills were passed directly from one generation to the next. A child learned by watching adults work, listening to stories, and practicing tasks repeatedly. Education happened not only in schools but throughout daily life. Experience served as one of the most valuable teachers. Despite the hardships, people continued to dream about improving their lives. A successful harvest, a profitable trade, a good marriage, or a healthy family represented meaningful achievements. Hope remained powerful even in difficult circumstances. It encouraged people to keep working, keep planning, and keep believing that tomorrow might be better than today. When we look beyond the castles, monarchs, and famous events, we find the true heart of Tudor England. It existed in cottages, workshops, fields, and village streets. It lived in the determination of ordinary people who faced uncertainty with courage and persistence. Their world was often difficult, sometimes dangerous, and frequently uncomfortable, but they endured. And through their endurance, they left behind a story that continues to fascinate us centuries later, revealing just how resilient human beings can be when confronted with the challenges of their time. The further we examine Tudor England, the more we realise that survival depended on adaptability. People constantly adjusted to changing circumstances. Whether those changes came from weather, economics, disease, or politics, flexibility was not a special skill reserved for a few individuals. It was a necessity for almost everyone. Families learned to make the most of limited resources, repair rather than replace possessions, and find creative solutions to everyday problems. One of the most striking differences between Tudor life and modern life was the absence of certainty. Today, many people expect regular access to food, healthcare, transportation, and information. Tudor citizens could never assume such things would always be available. Every year carried risks that could affect an entire household. Because of this, people often developed a strong appreciation for stability whenever they found it. A healthy family, a successful harvest, and peaceful conditions were considered blessings rather than guarantees. The physical landscape itself shaped how people thought. Vast stretches of countryside separated communities. Rivers, forests, and rough roads created natural barriers that influenced travel and communication. Many individuals spent most of their lives surrounded by familiar places and familiar faces. Their world was smaller in some ways, yet their connection to local communities was often much stronger than what many people experience today. Time was experienced differently as well. Without constant distractions, people paid close attention to natural cycles. The changing seasons, the movement of the sun, and the rhythms of agricultural work organised daily life. Nature was not something observed from a distance. It was a force that directly influenced survival. Every family understood the importance of weather because weather could determine whether a year would be prosperous or difficult. Yet, despite all the hardships and limitations, Tudor people continued building lives filled with meaning. They formed friendships, celebrated marriages, raised children, and created traditions that lasted for generations. They found joy in music, storytelling, festivals, and simple gatherings with family members. These moments of happiness remind us that people do not need perfect conditions to find purpose and connection. As historians look back on Tudor England, they often discover that the greatest story is not about kings, queens, or famous battles. It is about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with determination and resilience. Their world demanded strength, patience, and endurance on a daily basis. And although centuries separate us from them, their experiences continue to reveal something timeless about human nature. Even in the most difficult circumstances, people find ways to adapt, persevere, and keep moving forward. Perhaps the most important thing to remember about Tudor England is that the people living there did not know they were part of history. They were not thinking about how future generations would study their lives centuries later. They were focused on the same concerns that occupy people in every era: earning a living, protecting their families, maintaining friendships, and hoping for a better tomorrow. The extraordinary events that fill history books were often only distant background noise to ordinary citizens trying to navigate daily life. What makes the Tudor period so fascinating is the contrast between familiarity and difference. the emotions of the people remain recognizable. They felt happiness, fear, ambition, disappointment, love, and grief just as people do today. Yet the world surrounding those emotions was dramatically different. Every task required more effort. Every journey involved more risk. Every illness carried greater uncertainty. Life demanded a level of resilience that many modern societies rarely require. The passing of generations slowly transformed the kingdom. Children grew into adults, adults became elders, and traditions passed from one family to another. Knowledge survived because people shared it. Communities survived because people cooperated. Even during difficult years, life continued moving forward. Fields were planted, homes were repaired, businesses operated, and families adapted to changing circumstances. Looking back now, it is easy to focus on the strange customs and harsh realities that seem shocking from a modern perspective. Public punishments, limited medical knowledge, difficult working conditions, and social inequality all remind us how different the past could be. Yet those realities are only part of the story. Equally important is the determination shown by ordinary people who faced those challenges every day without giving up. Their lives remind us that history is not simply the story of powerful rulers or dramatic events. It is also the story of millions of ordinary individuals whose efforts built the foundations of the world that followed. Through hard work, persistence, and adaptability, the people of Tudor England endured a society that could be both unforgiving and remarkable, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to captivate us, offering a window into a world where many disturbing things were considered completely normal, yet where the strength of the human spirit remained just as powerful as it is today. There was also another side of Tudor England that many people rarely think about: the constant struggle against ignorance and uncertainty. Today, if something unusual happens, we can often find an explanation within seconds. Tudor people did not have that luxury. When crops failed, many wondered whether God was punishing them. When disease spread through a village, few understood the true causes. Strange events often inspired fear, because reliable information was difficult to obtain. Superstitions filled the gaps left by limited scientific knowledge. Dreams, omens, and signs were taken far more seriously than they are today. Many people believed that unusual natural events carried hidden meanings. A comet in the sky, an unexpected storm, or the sudden death of livestock could become the subject of intense discussion. Communities searched for explanations in religion, folklore, and local traditions. These beliefs influenced decisions and shaped how people understood the world around them. The danger of childbirth was another reality that modern audiences often underestimate. Today, childbirth is generally much safer because of medical advances. But in Tudor England it remained one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. Families celebrated births with joy. Yet there was always anxiety because complications could become deadly. The arrival of a child brought hope for the future, but it also carried significant risk for both mother and infant. Even simple injuries could become life-threatening. A broken bone, infected cut, or untreated wound might lead to serious complications. Many people carried scars from accidents that occurred during work, travel, or daily activities. Physical labour exposed individuals to risks constantly, and medical treatment could only do so much. Because danger was always present, people developed a practical attitude toward hardship. Weather forecasts did not exist, making farming even more uncertain. Families watched the sky closely and relied on experience, passed down through generations. A few weeks of unusual weather could determine whether an entire community enjoyed prosperity or suffered shortages. The connection between people and nature was immediate and unavoidable. Perhaps this is what made Tudor England such a tough place to live. It was not just one great challenge, but thousands of smaller uncertainties woven into everyday life. People never knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. Yet somehow they continued planting fields, raising children, building homes, and making plans. Their courage was often quiet and unnoticed, but it was present everywhere. In many ways, the real story of Tudor England is not about palaces or monarchs. It is about ordinary people facing an unpredictable world and finding the strength to keep going, day after day, year after year. Another reality that made Tudor England so challenging was the lack of personal security that modern people often take for granted. Today, many of us assume that emergency services, hospitals, and government institutions will help when disaster strikes. In Tudor times, help was often much farther away. If a house caught fire, neighbours became the first line of defence. If someone became seriously ill, family members and local healers did what they could. Survival depended heavily on the people around you rather than large organisations. Loneliness could also be dangerous. Communities expected people to participate in local life because strong social connections increased everyone's chances of survival. Villagers worked together during harvests, helped repair damaged buildings, and supported one another during difficult periods. While conflicts certainly existed, cooperation remained essential. A person who lost the trust of their community could find life much harder than someone who enjoyed the respect of neighbours. Food shortages created fear that lingered long after difficult years ended. Older villagers remembered times when harvests failed and prices rose beyond what ordinary families could afford. These memories shaped behaviour for decades. People learned to save what they could, waste as little as possible, and prepare for unexpected hardship. Even during prosperous years, many remained cautious because they understood how quickly fortune could disappear. The natural world felt powerful and unpredictable. Storms seemed more frightening when homes offered limited protection. Long winters felt harsher when food supplies were uncertain. Rivers that supported trade and farming could also flood and destroy valuable land. Tudor people respected nature because they knew they could not control it. Instead, they adapted their lives around its rhythms and challenges. What is perhaps most remarkable is that many Tudor people still found reasons to be optimistic. They looked forward to festivals, weddings, holidays, and family gatherings. They took pride in their work and celebrated achievements, no matter how small. Hope remained an important part of life because without it, enduring the difficulties of the age would have been far more challenging. As we continue exploring Tudor England, we begin to understand that the period was shaped not only by kings, queens, and famous events, but by countless ordinary individuals facing uncertainty with courage. Their world was filled with risks that modern people rarely encounter. Yet they continued building communities, creating traditions, and raising future generations. In doing so, they prove that resilience is often strongest when circumstances are at their most difficult. A lesson that remains just as relevant today as it was hundreds of years ago. The challenges of Tudor England did not end when the workday was over. Even during moments of rest, people lived with concerns that rarely disappeared completely. A parent might worry about a sick child sleeping in the next room. A farmer might lie awake wondering whether upcoming weather would damage crops. A merchant could be anxious about debts or the arrival of goods from another town. The future was uncertain, and uncertainty often followed people into their homes. Homes themselves offered limited protection from the outside world. Strong winds could find their way through walls and roofs. Heavy rain sometimes caused damage that required immediate repairs. During colder months, keeping a house warm demanded constant attention. Fires needed fuel, and fuel required effort to collect or purchase. Something as simple as staying comfortable during winter could become a daily challenge. For many families, disease remained one of the greatest fears, because it often arrived without warning. Entire communities understood how quickly illness could spread. When someone became seriously sick, neighbors frequently noticed because daily routines changed. Families gathered to help one another, but they also feared becoming ill themselves. This balance between compassion and caution was a constant part of life. Many people measured success differently than we do today. Wealth certainly mattered, but survival, stability, and family reputation were often equally important. Having enough food, maintaining a respectable household, and seeing children grow into healthy adults represented major accomplishments. In a world where so much could go wrong, even modest success felt significant. The passing years taught important lessons. Older generations remembered previous hardships and shared those experiences with younger family members. Stories about difficult winters, poor harvests, or outbreaks of disease became warnings and sources of practical knowledge. This transfer of experience helped communities prepare for future challenges and avoid repeating past mistakes. Perhaps that is why Tudor society endured for so long despite its hardships. Knowledge, traditions, and skills were constantly passed from one generation to the next. People learned not only how to survive, but also how to adapt. They understood that life would bring difficulties. Yet they continued planning, working, and hoping. When we step back and view Tudor England as a whole, we see a society built upon resilience. Ordinary people faced uncertainty almost every day of their lives. They lacked many advantages that modern societies consider essential. Yet they managed to create families, communities, and traditions that lasted for generations. Their world was often harsh, but their determination was remarkable. And the more we learn about their lives, the more we appreciate the extraordinary strength hidden within the ordinary people of Tudor England. One often forgotten aspect of Tudor life was how closely people lived alongside uncertainty from birth until death. Modern society is built around reducing risks wherever possible, but Tudor England offered few guarantees. Every stage of life carried challenges. Children faced dangerous illnesses. Adults endured exhausting labor. And older people often depended on family support because formal systems of care were limited. Security came not from institutions, but from relationships, reputation, and community ties. Daily routines were shaped by necessity rather than personal preference. Most people could not simply choose a different career, move across the country, or dramatically change their circumstances. Opportunities existed, but they were far fewer than those available today. As a result, many individuals focused on mastering the roles they had inherited. Farmers became better farmers. Craftsmen improved their skills. And families passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The sounds of nature remained a constant presence. Roosters announced the beginning of the day. Church bells marked important hours and events. Rain on rooftops, wind through trees, and the movement of animals were familiar parts of everyday life. Without the noise of modern machines, people often paid greater attention to their surroundings. Changes in weather, unusual sounds, or signs from the natural world were noticed quickly because they could carry important consequences. Communities also depended heavily on memory. Local knowledge was incredibly valuable. People remembered which fields produced the best harvests, which roads became dangerous during storms, and which remedies had helped during previous illnesses. This information was rarely stored in books. Instead, it lived in conversations, stories, and traditions passed from one generation to another. Yet despite all the hardships, Tudor people were not constantly miserable. They experienced moments of joy, humour, and celebration. Friends gathered together, families shared meals, and communities enjoyed festivals whenever opportunities arose. These moments mattered because they provided relief from the demands of daily life. Happiness was often found in simple things rather than material comforts. Perhaps that is one reason the Tudor era remains so fascinating today. It reminds us that human beings are capable of adapting to circumstances very different from our own. The people of Tudor England faced obstacles that would seem overwhelming to many modern individuals. Yet they continued moving forward. They worked, hoped, worried, laughed, and dreamed just as people do now. Their world may have been harsher, but their determination was extraordinary. And through that determination, they left behind a story that still captures our imagination centuries later as we continue deeper into the Tudor world. Another striking difference emerges: the relationship people had with time itself. Modern life often feels rushed, driven by schedules, deadlines, and constant notifications. Tudor people certainly worked hard, but their lives were shaped more by daylight, seasons, and natural rhythms than by precise clocks. Sunrise signaled the beginning of activity, and sunset often marked its end. Nature determined much of the pace of life. For ordinary villagers, the local church stood at the centre of community life. It was more than a place of worship. It was where people exchanged news, met neighbours, celebrated important events, and mourned losses together. In many communities, the church acted as a social anchor that connected everyone, regardless of age or occupation. A baptism, wedding, or funeral brought people together and reinforced the bonds that held society together. The Tudor era was also a time when rumours could have enormous influence. Without newspapers reaching every home, and without reliable ways to verify information, stories often travelled by word of mouth. A tale told by one traveller could spread across multiple villages within days. Sometimes the story remained accurate. Other times it became exaggerated with each retelling. Fear, excitement, and curiosity often shaped how information moved through society. People also developed remarkable practical skills. Many individuals could repair tools, grow food, care for animals, preserve supplies, and construct simple structures. Skills that are now handled by specialists were once part of everyday knowledge. Survival depended upon competence, the ability to solve practical problems was respected because it directly affected the well-being of families and communities. Life expectancy may have been shorter, but that did not mean life lacked meaning. People formed deep relationships, took pride in their achievements, and invested great effort in their families. Parents wanted opportunities for their children. Friends supported one another through difficult times. Communities celebrated successes together and shared burdens when tragedy struck. These human connections provided strength in a world where challenges were never far away. Perhaps the greatest misconception about Tudor England is the idea that people simply endured suffering without joy. The reality was more complex. Life was undeniably hard, yet people still laughed, told stories, sang songs, and looked forward to special occasions. Hope existed alongside hardship. Determination existed alongside fear, and it was this balance that allowed society to continue despite the many obstacles standing in its path. The more we learn about Tudor England, the clearer it becomes that history is ultimately a story of adaptation. Faced with uncertainty, ordinary people found ways to survive, support one another, and keep building for the future. Their world was very different from ours, but their resilience remains timeless. And so, as our journey through Tudor England slowly comes to an end, we are left with a picture of a world that was both familiar and astonishingly different. It was a land where disease could arrive without warning, where hard work filled nearly every day, and where survival often depended on the strength of family and community. Many of the things Tudor people accepted as normal would seem shocking to modern eyes. Public punishments, limited medical knowledge, dangerous travel, and constant uncertainty were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Yet the story of Tudor England is not simply a story of hardship. It is also a story of resilience. Ordinary men and women woke each morning and faced whatever challenges awaited them. They planted crops without knowing whether the harvest would succeed. They raised children in a world filled with risks. They built homes, learned trades, formed friendships, and created communities that endured through generations. Their courage was rarely celebrated in grand ceremonies, but it existed in countless small acts of perseverance performed every single day. The people of Tudor England did not see themselves as living in a difficult chapter of history. To them, this was simply life. They laughed with friends, worried about the future, fell in love, argued with neighbours, and dreamed about better days ahead. In Zenza they want from us. The technology, customs, and conditions may have changed dramatically, but the human experience remains surprisingly familiar across the centuries. Perhaps that is why studying the past is so fascinating. It reminds us that history is more than kings, queens, and famous battles. History is also the story of ordinary people whose names have been forgotten, but whose lives shaped the world that followed. The farmers who worked the fields, the craftsmen who built towns, the mothers who raised families, and the labourers who kept communities alive, all played their part in creating the future. When we look back on Tudor England, we see a society that could be harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. But we also see determination, adaptability, and hope. The people of that era endured challenges that would test anyone. Yet they continued moving forward. Their story reminds us that human beings have always possessed an extraordinary ability to survive, adapt, and find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. And now, as the candlelight fades and the sounds of Tudor England grow quiet, we leave this remarkable world behind. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most fascinating eras. Rest well, and remember that every chapter of history, no matter how distant, is ultimately a story about people just like us, searching for hope, purpose, and a better tomorrow. Good night.